To trade or not to trade? That is a question that plagues many a chess player the world over, and I found this game really instructive in helping to answer that question so that when you're sat at the board, you've got some ideas in mind as to whether or not to trade pieces. Now, this was played between Maxime Vachier-Lagrave with white, Alireza Firouzja with black. I've dug it up from May 2020. It was an online rapid event played in the Chess Bra Invitational. Now I'm having a look at this game and some others this week because they're between players that Alireza will be playing in next week's tournament, which he plays in Bucharest, Romania, the Grand Chess Tour. So Maxime kicked off with knight to f3. Alireza went d5. Pawn g3, knight f6, and now bishop g2. So it's a King's Indian attack from MVL, a very classic blitz opening. You get your bits out very quickly. Pawn to e6, castles from white, bishop e7, and now pawn to c4. Striking at the centre, Alireza just castled the king, and Maxime went d4. So we're in a Catalan position now. And here Alireza takes on c4, one of the classic ways to respond. The queen comes to c2, and now black doesn't play pawn b5 to defend this pawn. This diagonal is just too much of a problem to open at this stage. You can go pawn a4, a6 is no good to defend because that pawn's pinned to the rook, which is undefended. And if you go c6, then you can take here, pawn recaptures, and knight g5 is the move. Because now knight d5 is not possible to block the diagonal, or you're getting mated in one like this. So that's why knight g5, not knight e5 is the best way to play there. So we didn't have b5, of course. Alireza sees this, he goes pawn a6, and then after the queen captures, then he hits with pawn b5. It kicks the queen back, and he achieves this bishop b7. So that's always an accomplishment in itself when you're playing in these Catalan structures. But there is still a long-term strategic problem here of the backwards c7 pawn. Black needs to liberate that one to fully equalise the game here, so white keeps an edge. Bishop d2 now played by MVL, so he's looking to sink the bishop on a5 here where it pressures that pawn. And that's what the battle is centred around over the next few moves, and Alireza goes rook a7 to deal with this problem. One of the top computer moves, so he's in his prep. Now it looks really weird, but we'll see the idea behind this in the moment of vacating the a8 square for the queen. So rook d1 was played from MVL, anticipating the opening of the d file after say c5. Now we had knight b to d7, and after bishop to a5, here Alireza plays an excellent move. He goes queen to a8, just chucking that c7 pawn. MVL duly grabs it, but now rook c8 played, queen f4 and rook c2. So for the cost of a pawn, you've gotten rid of that weakness, all your pieces are well placed, and there's pressure here against both of these pawns. And MVL actually blunders here. So he wants to develop this knight, but he should bring it to d2. Then yes, you give this pawn, but okay, you start getting your pieces out. The pressure against this e2 pawn is gone. But what he does instead is go knight to c3. But this walks straight into pawn to b4. Now the knight would have to move somewhere, say knight to a4, then the rook can take on e2. Black's got a good game, this pawn's now isolated, nice position. But Alireza missed to go pawn b4. He went knight d5, this is a blitz game of course. Now Maxime can chop those ones off, the bishop recaptured, and the rook can come to d2, holding that second rank. And this is where there's a really instructive moment. So how would you play here if you were Alireza? Your rook's attacked. And if you're enjoying this video, do hit that like button to let me know, and consider subscribing to the channel to never miss my Alireza games in the upcoming Grand Chess Tour. So the best move here for black is to retreat the rook. That's what Alireza played. If you chop off like this, then after the queen recaptures, well, you've just improved the white pieces and you've ceded the only open file on the board. You can't bring a rook to the file or this bishop will take you. If you bring the queen across, we go rook to c1. So this is the problem, white wins the c file. But if you do what Alireza does, which is drop the rook back, well now you've got the c file still as black. You can't go rook c2 or it gets taken. You can't go rook c1. So really nice play from Alireza, very instructive retreat. So MVL goes A3, covers B4, also protects that pawn from the bishop attack so he can move his rook in future. We now had knight to F6 from Alireza, looks at E4, and now you can shuffle with the major pieces. You could go say rook to D3 or queen E3, but MVL plays more directly. He goes knight to E1, exchanging these bishops, bringing the knight around. Now this isn't a beautiful square, but if we imagine the queen moving out of the way, say to E3, the rook coming to D3, then this knight could come to F4 or E3, and at some point white can think about pushing the D5 pawn. So white still retains an edge here. We now had knight to E4 from Alireza, rook D3, the rook came down to C2, hitting these pawns, and now you can go F3 already, kicking that knight, but I can understand why MVL didn't want to create weaknesses, so he went queen F3 instead, holding the E2 pawn. Yes, you give black this one, but now rook C1. An excellent move, taking that open C file, and here Alireza makes a mistake. So he wants to improve this knight, and the best way to do it is by bringing it to D6 and then into C4. You block the C file, you attack this bishop, and so on. But Alireza goes knight G5, he attacks the white queen, and here again is an instructive moment. Do you swap off these queens that are now looking at each other, or do you play queen to E3? Well, this was the right way to play, because by keeping the queens on the board, you start to make this knight look really silly. You've got moves like H4 coming. If knight H3 check, you go king F1. And again, this knight struggling for squares. D5 is coming soon, the knight's coming to F4. The white pieces are just much better placed than the black pieces. This one's kind of stuck, this one's kind of stuck. Really good initiative for white, big advantage. But after MVL trades these queens here, he helps solve Alireza's problems, because now the rook recaptures, and because white has to go king F1 holding this pawn, it gives black this chance to start attacking on the queen side with rook to A2 here. So it's targeting this pawn twice, using this bishop on E7. Bishop B4 played to defend. We had these ones being captured, the pawn took back, and now rook B2 comes behind attacking, so Maxime has to get something going through the centre of the board because Alireza is about to have two connected passes on the queen side. So he goes pawn F3, covers E4 from the knight, and that knight's actually about to get trapped with pawn to H4. So H6 played, gives the knight a square. Now we had knight to E3, preparing D5. The rook took on B4, pawn D5 played, captures, knight captures, hitting this rook, and so it came back to B2 here. And now the knight came to F4, excellent move from MVL. It covers the E6 square so that this knight can't hop back. And now the rook can also come down, you're threatening H4, so Alireza recognises he has to get some counterplay going. He goes pawn to A5 here. Then rook D7 came, coming to the 7th. Pawn A4, H4 kicked this knight. It had to come to H7, and after the rook's doubled, this looks really scary, but Alireza finds a brilliant defensive manoeuvre. He goes knight F6, not passively going to F8 with the rook. Now he's giving this pawn, but then he gets knight E8, covering G7. Really beautiful manoeuvring. And now this rook is attacked by the knight, and best here for MVL was technically to play rook to A7. You could have this exchange like this, but then at least you're behind the pawn. But I can understand why he didn't play like this. I mean, visually this looks awful. Black's got the two connected passes. He wants to go for counterplay against the black king. So he didn't go rook to A7 here. Instead, MVL put the rook on E7, and after pawn A3, he goes knight G6, threatening rook F8, trying to set a mating net. Alireza goes A2, and now check, king H7, pawn H5, the trap is now shut, rook H8 mate is threatened, but Alireza makes a queen just in time. Now the king comes to G2 here. How do you actually proceed as black? Your time's ticking down. There's a threat to go mate. How do you block that one? Well, knight F6 was played by Alireza. Excellent move. The knight also could have come to D6 or C7, but you had to move that knight, open up this rook to protect the square, and now you can't checkmate here, so MVL snaps off on F6. also using the pin of this pawn, but a beautiful finish by Alireza. The swashbuckling rook takes on e2, and this rook's overloaded. Here MVL resigned the game. Now if you take this rook, then we capture here with the queen, and this is an overwhelming material advantage. If you enjoyed this game, then click here to see another amazing Alireza game. Thanks for watching and see you soon.